Hello, and welcome to this presentation on public participation in climate adaptation planning. I'm David Bidwell. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Marine Affairs at the University of Rhode Island, and I appreciate this opportunity to talk about this topic. I think it's an interesting one, and hopefully you find it useful in your work. Just to give a little idea to start out of what we're going to talk about today. I want to spend some time talking about why we think of public participation in adaptation planning, and then think more generally about what is public participation, think about some characteristics of successful participation. We'll end with maybe a couple of caveats about using public participation in adaptation planning and where there might be some difficulties as well. As I start out the presentation, I want to acknowledge that a lot of this content comes from a variety of places and resources. There are a number of different reports and academic articles about participation and about climate adaptation. There's one resource that this presentation borrows from very heavily. Back in 2008, the National Research Council put out this report, Public Participation in Environmental Assessment and Decision Making, and it really provides a good overview of the use of public participation in environmental decisions. In addition to that literature, I also have some personal experience. I spent about 6 or 7 years as a public participation consultant working on a variety of different kinds of environmental projects. That's me in the back of that room, probably 10 or 12 years ago, speaking to a group of stakeholders at a community advisory board. In addition, I spent about 3 years from 2010 to 2013 as the program manager for the Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessment Center. That's a NOAA-funded center, a collaboration between the University of Michigan and Michigan State University that deals with climate change issues and trying to inform people about the practice of adaptation in the Great Lakes region. So that's the background that I'm bringing to this. And so I'll speak about public participation and try to give some insights into how it might apply to climate adaptation. So what is it that we're talking about when we talk about climate adaptation? This is probably a scene that some of you are very familiar with, or scenes like this. This is the 2012 flood in Duluth, Minnesota, in which they experienced a very heavy precipitation event. So, you know, when we talk about adaptation, we're talking about a response to impacts or the potential impacts of climate change. Climate change impacts are often seen as these kinds of extreme events, but it also includes more gradual changes, such as the expansion of one tree species into an area where it hasn't been seen previously. Adaptation, of course, can mean how you respond to impacts once they happen, but planning for adaptation is mostly concerned with anticipatory adaptation. So how do you think about the potential impacts that may be coming in the future, and how can you build more resilient systems that can better withstand those impacts when they do happen? A number of recent reports have advocated a participatory approach to adaptation planning, and this includes some reports done here in the United States as well as in other countries and the UK and Australia. This is a quote from the U.S. Global Change Research Program, who puts out the National Climate Assessment. The last big assessment was put out in 2014. And they point out that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to adaptation, but there are some general similarities across regions and sectors that can be learned from. And that sharing those best practices is important, and that includes stakeholder involvement, which you can see I highlighted there. In addition, the National Research Council back in 2010 put out a series of reports called America's Climate Choices. And you can see here a statement that talks about the importance of engaging stakeholders and groups that are affected by climate change in planning. It says stakeholders will be affected by climate change or who will be involved in implementing adaptation should have a role, as each group is likely to bring different values, objectives, and perspectives to the process. So we'll dig in a little bit more to how public participation relates to climate adaptation, but I just wanted to give the upfront acknowledgement that there seems to be a growing understanding of the importance of public participation in adaptation planning. Now, this may reflect sort of a general turn in natural resource management and environmental planning towards participatory points of view, but there are also some specific aspects to adaptation planning that really make it ripe for a participatory approach. There was a report put out by the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization in Australia, which is essentially its national science agency on thinking about engaging people in adaptation planning. And in this report, they point out that there are a couple of things about adaptation that really make it appropriate for participation. One is that adaptation to climate change is highly contextualized, which is the approach that you're going to take to adaptation is going to be very specific to the region that you're in, the community that you're in, and the particular problems that you're finding. And what that means is that there's no good cookie-cutter approach to adaptation. So each time that you're thinking about adaptation planning, you have to think about the needs of a particular context. In addition, adaptation usually requires the cooperation or collaboration of the people and the managers in that particular area who have to think about making substantial changes in how they approach their work and their practices. So that integration of people into the planning process can be very, very important. In addition, this is a quote from that America's Climate Choices report that was put out by the National Research Council. And they say adaptation is fundamentally a risk management strategy. Now, there is a very large literature on risk and risk management and dealing with these kinds of environmental risks. And that literature also stresses the importance of participatory approaches in managing risk. There's a couple of scholars that I'm particularly fond of, Ortwin Wren and one of his collaborators, Andreas Klinke, who have talked about characteristics of risk that justify a participatory approach. And they talk about these three aspects. One is complexity. When you have a situation or a case in which you're dealing with lots of interrelated systems and various positive and negative feedback loops, you're really thinking of nonlinear processes. And when you have that kind of complexity, that makes it appropriate for participation. Also, issues of scientific uncertainty. And I think we can all say that while there's a consensus that climate change is occurring and that it's primarily caused by human actions, the resulting changes in weather and in ecological systems are much less certain. Also, there's a high level of uncertainty regarding future scenarios. What does the future hold? What are the rates of change going to be? How do climate stressors interact with other stressors? We all know that there are other kinds of things that we have to deal with when we talk about environmental management or planning, and they're going to interact with these climate effects as well. Another big area of uncertainty around climate is we just don't know how people are going to respond. People are tricky. They have freedom of choice. And so we're just not quite sure how changes in the climate are going to induce different kinds of human behavior that's out there. The third aspect of characteristics that justify participation in risk management is something that they call ambiguity of values. And what that means is that something that you're probably familiar with in terms of different kinds of environmental management, they often require balancing of different values and interests. And Different people want to get different things out of environmental management and planning. And when you think about climate change, there are probably times with climate change where there are going to be winners and losers. Different preferences by different stakeholder groups in what they would like to see as a potential future. And so when you have those aspects, it particularly makes a situation ripe for public participation. So what do we mean when we talk about public participation? So I've been using this phrase. First, I want to acknowledge that there are lots of different words for this. So you may see it called public involvement. You may see it called public engagement. Sometimes they use the word stakeholder and can use in different combinations: stakeholder engagement, stakeholder participation, stakeholder involvement. In the end, they're really all talking about very similar things, and those terms are often used interchangeably. We're going to use the term public participation today to think about that. So again, what is public participation? There's a good article by some authors, Rowe and Frewer, who talk about public engagement, and they talk about public participation as a particular kind of public engagement. So there are different ways of engaging the public in decision-making. At one level, we have what are often called public communication techniques, in which a sponsor of a process or an organizer of a process, they call it sponsor, is transferring communication directly to the public or to stakeholders. And we often think of this in terms of environmental communication and how do you reach these different audiences. Then there are these ideas of public consultation. And in public consultation, per this framework, you're really talking about how we get communication from the public or from stakeholders to a sponsor or to a decision maker. And many of you are probably familiar with public hearings or public comment periods as part of the regulatory process. And again, this is another kind of one-way transfer of information. We tend to put out a decision or a report or an issue and say, tell us what you think about things. For this framework, they really talk about public participation as being a two-way mode of communication, where there's a flow of information both from a sponsor or a decision-making agency to the public, but as well a flow of information back from the public to the sponsor. And often this is seen as opportunities where people really sit down together and participate in a dialogue where there's a two-way flow of information. So people have tried to define public participation, and you can find lots of definitions out there. This is from that report that I talked about at the very beginning, from Public Participation in Environmental Assessment and Decision-Making, that was put out by the National Research Council. And they describe public participation as a variety of mechanisms and processes that are used to involve or draw members of the public and their representatives into the activities of both public and private sector organizations that are engaged in informing or making environmental assessments or decisions. I think of that as a very cumbersome definition, but it certainly hits all the highlights. There is also an organization out there called the International Association for Public Participation. They have a much simpler definition of public participation, that public participation is a means to involve those who are affected by a decision in the decision-making process. And so that's a fairly simple part. They further define that participation promotes sustainable decisions, so those are decisions that have a lasting effect, by providing participants with the information that they need to be involved in a meaningful way, and also communicating how their input affects those decisions. One issue that I want to address straight out is this idea of the public versus stakeholders. In general, within the field of public participation, we use the term stakeholder when we're talking about organized groups that are interested in or affected by a decision. They're usually represented by a designated individual. It could be a volunteer, it could be a staff member, it could be an elected official. that are coming into a process and representing this interest. When we talk to the public, we're usually talking about individuals who are interested or affected in a decision, but they're not organized in any way as a group. And so if you think about a public workshop or a public hearing, you often see these individual members of the public. In reality, out in the field, these terms are often used interchangeably. I may say stakeholder, I may say public during this presentation. We're really talking about the same thing. Groups or individuals who think of themselves as being affected by or that they are interested in a particular decision. When we talk about public participation, there are a number of different goals that people often talk about being able to be achieved with participation. And again, you can look through the literature and find different kinds of frameworks. One of the most popular frameworks looks at three basic goals or purposes of participation, and this was done by Daniel Fiorino back in 1990. And these three goals are instrumental goals, which is we can use participation to really focus on achieving a particular goal or outcome. So we're trying to achieve a predetermined goal. We're trying to build support for a decision or build legitimacy for a decision that's being made. Substantive goals are much more focused on decision quality in that they're trying to bring in important expertise or information into the decision process. And this expertise can be technical expertise from different disciplines. It can be trying to bring in local expertise, people who know about a particular land or how the land is used. It can be cultural expertise. It can be about expertise on values. What is it that's important to a community or to different users or different stakeholders around a decision? Finally, there are a number of normative goals that go along. And this is basically when we do public participation because it's the right thing to do. Here in the United States and in other Western cultures, we often talk about values of Western democracy, that being that people have a right to engage or influence the decisions that affect them or the things that they value. There are other normative justifications. Sometimes people think about it in terms of social learning and trying to develop capacity of communities to tackle different problems. And also issues around justice and empowerment, and I think we're starting to see more dialogue around climate justice and thinking about groups that may be bearing more or less of the impacts, and those who may have been traditionally underrepresented within a decision process. And so we can think of participation as a way of trying to level out that playing field as well. When we think of these goals, it's not that one goal is necessarily right and another is wrong, but they do have different effects on how a process is designed. Also, it's not necessarily that there's going to be one goal in a process. You may be approaching several different goals when you design a process and think about participation. All right, well, what do we know about public participation and how effective it is? Here, I'm going to go back to this NRC report in 2008. It's really one of the most thorough looks at this use of public participation in environmental decision-making. They looked at hundreds of documents and studies. They looked at the case literature. They had a panel who wrote the report with lots of different kinds of expertise in this. And this is the final conclusion that they came up with. It says, when done well, public participation improves the quality and legitimacy of decisions and builds the capacity of all involved to engage in the policy process. Well, let's pick this apart a little bit more. First, they say when it's done well. And this acknowledges that there's actually a lot of poor planning processes out there. And when a process is not done well, public participation can actually backfire. It can cause obstruction to decisions being done. It can cause poor quality decisions, and it can create long-term problems with trust. So it is important that a process be done well, and we'll talk in a few minutes about some of the ways that we do participation well. One is that the outcomes can be that you can improve the quality of a decision. So it can, there are lots of different ways of measuring quality, such as stakeholder satisfaction, cost-benefit considerations, achieving goals that you had for the project, and coming up with decisions that are consistent with community or stakeholder values. When we think about legitimacy, we think of ways that public participation can build trust, both in a decision as well as the decision makers, both in the eyes of the participants in the process and other members of the public as well. Even those who do not engage in the decision can see a decision as more legitimate if it was reached in a participatory manner. The final is this idea of building capacity, and there's been some work recently in thinking about participation as a mode of social learning. By bringing people together and talking through an issue and thinking through decisions, you can actually build the capacity of all of the people who were engaged to think more clearly about the policy process and to understand more about the issue that was the focus. So what is it that leads to a successful participation process? In that NRC report, they provided lots of different characteristics that lead to a successful participation process. But overall, there's a clear conclusion there. There's no cookbook to successful participation. There are many approaches and many strategies and many mechanisms that can be successful in engaging people and engaging stakeholders in the decision. So if you're looking for a step 1, step 2, step 3, it's going to be really hard to find that in a way that helps you think about planning. As we said before, adaptation is contextual, and so I'm not able to offer particular steps that will get you to success. However, there are recommendations in this report that are based on all the things they looked at that are characteristics that you often see in successful projects. Now, there's probably no projects that hold all of these characteristics, but they do give you an idea of what predicts success. And so the report looks at management principles, process principles, ways to incorporate science, and then this sort of best process idea about implementation. And we'll spend a couple of minutes talking about each of these. From the management principles, these are really the responsibilities of the process sponsor. So often it's an agency or a company or an organization that has brought people together to make a decision. And so the important pieces here are that you provide a clarity of the purpose of the process, that there's a real commitment to letting the process inform an action or a decision, that adequate funding and staff are devoted to a process, that the process focuses on implementation. So not just making the decision, but how is that decision going to be implemented in practice? And then a commitment to self-assessment all throughout the process and trying to figure out how well are you doing and how is it that you can make the process better. I want to highlight a couple of these in terms of adaptation planning. The first is the clarity of purpose. It is really critical that you understand what your goals are for participation and that those goals and that purpose is clearly communicated to the stakeholders that are out there. Oftentimes, participatory processes have problems because the participants are expecting one thing, but the sponsor or the agency who's putting on the process is expecting something else. So really being clear about what those processes are. The second is this idea of a commitment of letting a process inform the action. And I would say again here, it's very important to understand what your commitment is to how much a process can actually influence a decision and communicating that clearly to all of the people involved. Oftentimes, this requires a real gut check for an organization that is convening a process. What can you actually commit? There are often limits in terms of regulations and how much power an agency has to make decisions in a process. And again, it's important to know that and communicate it. It's also important that the leaders of an organization are also committed to the process. Nothing is worse than a participatory process where maybe you engage with people for months or years, and then at the very end, the rug is pulled out from under that group because someone higher up in an organization decides that they're just going to push through a decision that didn't involve this group of people. So really having that commitment from the start, from the powers to be, is really critically important. Okay, thinking about process principles. So these are really characteristics of the process itself. And what this NRC panel came up with is that it is important the process be inclusive, that it is collaborative in the way that you define not just the problem that is going to be tackled, but also the process that you're going to use to get there. And that it's important that you not just show up and say, here's how we're going to do it, but that you sit down and say, what seems like a good process to get there. That process should be transparent. Here are the steps that we're going to use, or the roadmap that we're going to use to get to a decision, and that there has to be good faith communication. So all along the way, there needs to be a free flow of information about what's happening, who is being involved, and what the steps are of getting to a decision. Here again, I want to highlight one of these points, and this is inclusivity. Oftentimes, you have people who may oppose your organization or people who are friends, and it's very important to think broadly about who are the people who not just are affected by a decision, but who see a decision as important to their interests or affecting things that they value. And when you're thinking about climate adaptation, that can be difficult sometimes to do. And we'll talk later about some important parts of the process, but one of those is really doing your homework and getting out there and finding out who it is that is really interested in this issue. A third component that they tackled in this report was about how to incorporate science. A good participatory process is grounded in science, but that science should also be conducted in a particular way. And the term that is often used is an analytic deliberative process. And the reason they use this is that it thinks about this balance between both facts and values. So here are the points that they make, the recommendations they make for characteristics of the good way or the best ways to incorporate science and technical information. One is that the information that's being used is transparent. People know what information is being used in decision making, as well as how that information is being analyzed. You should be attending to both facts and values in the process, and I'll touch on that in just a moment. You want to be explicit about assumptions and uncertainties that are existing around a decision. There may be times where having an independent review or having an outside organization, sometimes we talk about universities or extension places as being a boundary organization that can come in and be independent in the way that they present the science, or just reviewing what's there, sort of an independent peer review, if you will. And finally, that a process of analysis should be iterative and adaptive. So let's think about some of these components. The first is attending to both facts and values. So while there is a technical scientific side, we want to make sure that we're not getting the science right, but that we're getting the right science. And so that is, we need to let values, what's important, help to determine what are the right questions to be asking in a process. So that may be sitting down with stakeholders and saying, what is important to you? And then thinking about what scientific information you need to get out of it in order to answer those values. Second is being explicit about assumptions and uncertainties. And when we talk about climate adaptation, there are lots of uncertainties that come into play when we talk about climate science. It is very important that we think about those uncertainties, and that often we present science in terms of a range of possible futures that are out there. And finally, being iterative and adaptive. And I just want to give one example. When I was at GLESA, at the Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessment Center, we funded different organizations to do processes. This is from the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. They did a planning process in the region of Peel, and I know that this is difficult to see, but each of those black circles up here in this chart, this is a roadmap for their decision making, is a point at which they really went back to the stakeholders and said, what do you think? So first they met with stakeholders and said, what are the important decisions? Then they went away and they collected some information around that. They came back and they said, here are the information sources that we have. Do these seem like the right ones? Then they did analysis and they came back again and they said, here's the output of what we did in terms of asking these questions. Does it seem like we're getting to the right place? So you can see they came back at several points in the process from the technical side to say, is this the right information? Have we gone about it the right way? And they were very successful in coming up with some recommendations for implementation in this region. So finally, thinking about how do you implement this? And again, here are the recommendations that came out of this in terms of a best process for thinking about how to do participation. You have to first diagnose the context of what it is that you're doing. Then you have to collaborate on the choice of techniques and how you're going to do participation. You need to monitor that process, and it has to be iterative to overcome difficulties. If you reach a point and a sticking point, you have to make sure that you're willing to take the time and the effort to work through the problems that are there. I want to highlight one more thing, which is this diagnosis of context. We talked about adaptation being right for participation because it is context dependent. It's very important at the outset of a participatory process that you really do your homework and think about what are the issues that are there? What's the history of this issue? What's the history of relationships among the different stakeholders and relationships between the stakeholders and the public and the agency that's sponsoring this? Because those are going to have big effects on the participation process and how you go about engaging it. So that's a step that people often miss, but it's really critical in terms of setting up a participatory process. Okay. So finally, I want to just touch on some caveats about using participation in an adaptation planning process. The first is that public participation is not a panacea, okay? It doesn't solve every problem that's out there, and it's not necessarily going to make everybody happy with a process. There's no silver bullet for climate adaptation, and you can't look at public participation or a participatory process as being that silver bullet. It's not necessarily going to be smooth, but if done correctly, participation can really help reach those goals. Finally, there are some characteristics to adaptation that can create obstacles or roadblocks to participation. One is we often talk about climate change not being salient to people because oftentimes we're looking out into the future, and it can be difficult to make those issues salient to people in terms of getting them involved with things. Second, there are some misconceptions about climate science out there, and so when you get into the adaptation process, it can really require going slow to begin with to make sure that everybody is on the same page in terms of what climate science says and what's known, and understanding about how we get to these conclusions and where different levels of confidence are. Finally, there is skepticism and there are political aspects around climate that can make a situation difficult and that often limit how we're able to do participation and who we're able to draw into a process. So that can create problems. And then finally, there is sometimes in a location a history of poor participation or participation that wasn't done well. And it can require a lot of time and effort to build the trust back within the community that you want to do things in a different way. Finally, I just want to highlight some resources that are out there in terms of participation for public participation and for participation in adaptation. These are this NRC report that I talked about, and along with that, Dr. Thomas Dietz, who was one of the main authors, did a presentation at the Sackler Colloquium for NRC back in 2012, and that's on the video, and so that's a good resource to turn to as well. America's Climate Choices has a good section on adapting to the impacts of climate change, and they talk about participatory elements in that, as does the National Climate Assessment. And then don't be afraid to look outside the U.S. as well. As I said, this Australian report really tackles these issues of participation. So that's it for my presentation. I hope it's been helpful and can help you towards your path of planning for adaptation, and I wish you the best of luck in your approaching this.